So they argue that we should unmoor our understanding from a particular instantiation and rather try and look at these processes as living forces existent within the present. And if we do that, I would argue we not only understand fascism today in a clearer way, but actually we have a better understanding of the past. There's been some interesting work coming out from Patel and McMichael, which has argued that much of what we recognize in fascism was present long before the Nazis or the Italian fascists. So they say fascism's technologies of control, its ideology, its body count, and even its concentration camps preceded the European models of fascism. That was Hannah Arendt's argument that the only thing that was unique about the Nazi Holocaust was that it happened in Europe. The Nazis extended what was a familiar practice across the colonial world. Then the very last part, an emergent fascist trajectory. If we take that understanding of fascist processes and then start to try and identify whether they exist in the world today, the general argument seems to be, if you accept fascism as a political economic process, is that we see today longer term causes and manifestations of a structural crisis within capitalism. That hasn't only started in the last year or two, but goes back to the 1970s, and this deeper crisis, this structural or systemic crisis within accumulation, what some have called the general crisis of Pax Americana, what others have called this crisis of capitalism as an all-embracing structural crisis, which we can see in these deepening contradictions around accumulation, financialization and debt, geopolitics, energy crises, climatic crises, a doctrine of war without end, the moment of peak oil, crisis around hunger and food, all of which are manifestations of a deeper structural crisis of accumulation. So I finished off by trying to look at a few things we might see as technologies of or processes associated with fascism today. One of them, the obsession with leaders. And I would say the cult around Obama is one of those latest manifestations. But we could see it in Berlusconi in Italy, Putin in Russia, and I put Blair and Harper on the table too.
They're wannabes.
Yeah. Secondly, the invention of enemies, the political desire for war, this obsession with national security, which we can see in the supposed threat and fear-mongering towards so-called immigrant labour across the far-right parties in Europe, including the recent election of British National Party officials, but also evident in our much vaunted war on terror, the threat of so-called rogue states, the axis of evil, the ideology of war without end, and then finally, clearly the rise of nationhood as a mooring for identity. Interestingly, not only on the right, but also on the left. We can see it in post-Soviet Russia with the extreme right, the new Indian right, but also within assertions of left nationalism, which dominate social democratic movements and labour, organised labour. So in summary, I would argue that fascism is a political economic system that the capitalist class resorts to during periods of crisis, decay, degeneration, and that we are living through an age of such upheaval, that rather than shy away from the use of the term fascism, problematic as it is, that we need to be informed and to be producing sharper analysis of what could be seen as the rise of fascist processes or an emergent fascist trajectory within the world today.
Understanding that fascism is not just a political process, but also an economic process, is a good starter for social justice. But what Alison calls the silence of the left is a deeper symptom of a political apathy. In other words, human rights struggles in other parts of the world, or even our own political decision-making here at home, doesn't concern us. Now, if that is not the case, add your opinion on nowpolling.ca so it can be counted.